This is Anders Corr with the Journal of Political Risk. We're going to be discussing Africa, extremism, and influence today with Robert Whitcomb from the New England Diary and Douglas Laventer, a data reporter for Bloomberg News. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me. I'm sure you noticed in the news today there was a major attack in Tunisia. 19 tourists were killed by Islamic extremists, most likely. What do you guys make of that?
Maybe I'll speak first. I think it's a way of trying to sabotage pro-Western sympathies in Tunisia. Tunisia has been, certainly by Arab Spring standards, quite successful in moving toward democracy. And I think this is a way of unsettling the economy and the government there by, in part, scaring away foreign investment and foreign tourists. Tunisia has always attracted a lot of European tourists in particular, in general, and French tourists in particular. And I think this is a way of unsettling its capability of becoming a stable democracy.
Well, thanks, Bob. Can you adjust your picture there a little bit? Doug, what do you make of it?
No, all I was going to say is I think Bob's focus on the attack on the tourism industry is spot on. If you're wanting to scare away direct investment, one of the best ways that you can do that is by first scaring away people from visiting the country in the first place. Tunisia is largely driven by tourism, largely from European tourists, as you met. But now it was also the fact that they used to, and I believe this was quoted in a Bloomberg story earlier, there was a modern history professor that said that terrorists used to target security forces largely well outside the capital in any sort of similar attack like this. And the fact that they attacked tourists right in the heart of the capital of Tunisia, I think is a very clear signal that that they're here to play and they're here to stay.
Yeah, the brazenness of attacking in the middle of Tunis, big city, relatively popular among Europeans, is obviously symbolically very important, and it shows the, if not ineptitude, the thinness of security precautions.
Absolutely.
Right. I mean, what's particularly upsetting about it to me is that Tunisia is the one Arab country where the Arab Spring, legalization, peace. I think it's a very nice secular government there, relatively speaking. Right. Whereas in all of the other Arab Spring countries, things really went badly. When we're talking about Syria or Iraq or Yemen or Egypt, things simply didn't go well for the Arab Spring. Tunisia was one small point of light there that it looks like the Islamists are trying to sabotage the country.
And it was the start of it. The Arab Spring started in Tunisia. It's the dictator there, the fruit peddler, whoever he was, lighting himself on fire. That's what started all this. Absolutely, and it's just the mere proximity to Algeria, Libya, and Egypt. We saw it spread in a very good sort of sense of wildfire across northern Africa. But now, especially with this attack in the capital, you're seeing very spotty sort of candle lights of resistance to any form of what you could have once considered an Arab Spring spotting up all over northern Africa and the Middle East, particularly with the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and what I believe it's called Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, and all of these self-described groups that are rising with little to no resistance and very often support, whether explicit or implicit, from some of these countries in which they're rising. I might mention also there are a lot of Libyans, for what it's worth, there are a lot of Libyans in Tunisia, and the chaos in Libya, the near anarchy, the tribal fighting, of course, the Islamic State has moved in there big time, right next door, and in a porous border. That's another great danger. Very incendiary neighborhood.
Well, and I think it's a quite...
A lot of these smaller Boko Haram and these local Tunisian Islamists are now claiming allegiance to Islamic State far away. Now, one question is, to what extent is there really command and control from Baghdad or from Syria of these small African Islamist groups?
I think there is a general guidance. My instinct from my own somewhat superficial tours of the Middle East and from reading is that there are connections, there are promises of aid, there are promises of weaponry, but the connections are not particularly well consolidated yet. There's too much distance, and there are too many local issues, too many local tribal identity issues. So I think this is a way of the local agitators, you will, the local terrorists, of giving themselves more weight. They say, we're part of the Islamic State, so you've got more to be afraid of. I have a feeling the connections sort of administratively are somewhat sketchier. I don't think this is like a big company, like sort of IBM with its, Tunisian subsidiaries, all that.
Yeah, if anything, I would agree with you that it's likely a sort of self-ascribing to lend some sort of credence to what they're doing. That being said, being the age that I am too, you can't, as much as I hate to say it, you cannot discredit the power of social media, both in the Arab Spring and then also in the spread of Islamic State through these areas. Whether or not there is any sort of central command, I can't make that argument particularly. You have to acknowledge the fact that it has become progressively easier for these groups to chat across borders instantaneously and either share intelligence or to share potential targets or to basically discuss the basic tenets of what is sometimes a cracked up philosophy.
Well, yeah, I mean, they certainly can refer to history and the caliphate. I mean, the height of the Arab Empire, stretching from what's now Iran all the way over to Morocco and Spain, and North Africa was sort of in the middle of this. The fascinating thing that to me, Doug could probably speak to this with far more eloquence than me, is how much this would have happened without social media. I mean, it's just extraordinary. The last few years, the ability to knit together to some extent all these disparate groups, Boko Haram and everything. How much of this is social media? How much of this could be done before? And like in my heyday as a journalist with faxes and telexes and that kind of thing. Of course, you don't need the paper that people used with faxes and telexes.
Well, yeah, and even 10 years ago, in some of these countries still, which just do not have infrastructure. If you want to talk about the old paper mail route, basically,
that would be a letter.
Weeks and weeks for information to disseminate, and now it very much is instantaneous. You can upload. Doesn't even have to be a satellite phone in many cases. In even some of the most remote areas, there will be even what I guess would be the equivalent of a low bandwidth like AT&T Edge connection, which is more than enough to send 140 characters in a picture.
Well, it reminds me a little of the Tiananmen Square uprising where there was a lot of faxing going on. I was sort of the end of some of the faxing coming in from the dissidents, some of whom were then murdered by the Beijing regime. And they're sending faxes to universities here. That's right before my ex-cousin-in-law, Berners-Lee, invented the web, and it was remarkable. I thought that was sort of fabulous. There was even sort of the
Bob, I have to say, I have to break in here, Bob, and just say that it seems like the leader of Boko Haram has been fiercely independent.
Yeah.
As far as he did claim allegiance to Islamic State. But I think it's important not to make too much of these supposed claims of allegiance. We also saw the same claim of allegiance coming from Afghanistan, and nothing seems to be coming of that. No major changes.
I think this is for local
and there's also a big animist sort of. A lot of Africa is animist or Christian. Right. They're not actually Islamic. So there's a lot of Islamics, but I don't think that we can say that Africa is being swept up into the Islamic extremism frenzy. I think it happens here and there. It's quite violent when it does, but there's a lot of peaceful areas in Africa, or relatively peaceful areas in Africa.
And here's not affected by this. For not overhyping it. I certainly don't think that's what either of us were doing in this case. It's quite simply the fact that when we were attacked and even in the small cells that we're seeing pop up in the U.S., it is prevalent. It is here, and I don't think that you can discredit that fact, especially when the supposed or the alleged leader of Boko Haram is saying that he's is disrupting Nigerian elections.
Yeah.
When you actually are able to instill yourself in the mentality of the country, regardless of whatever its religious or political leanings are, I think that they've succeeded in a mental game in as much as we understand, which often is much more important than the physical side. And you certainly know about that, Anders.
It gives them credibility.
It thinks it has been heavily taken by the extremists there. So that's a place where they've really taken half the country, and they are taking territory and holding territory, which is Boko Haram has done some of that, and we see Al Qaeda doing that in Yemen too. So I think that's of concern.
And yet, say the West Africa countries are banding together. There's some announcement yesterday, I think, from Mali about getting together to fight Boko Haram. Boko Haram is using this to pump up its sense of credibility, being part of a great international organization, and it's meant to scare people. At the same time, the West Africans are pushing back against it because of this, even more so because of this foreign affiliation. So it sort of cuts both ways.
I think in Cameroon, I know that Cameroon is sending troops, and a couple of Central African Republic, I think, sending troops across the border.
That's right.
Into Nigeria to combat Boko Haram.
Yeah.
And so what you see is a regional movement of militaries going after these Islamic extremists. And I believe that they're doing so in part because Western nations just aren't as ready to jump in with ground forces into Islamic extremist areas because they were burned in Afghanistan and Iraq.
And you have an electorate, in our case with an upcoming election, and across the EU and the developed world that is not going to settle for another long extended ground war. It would not, I believe that you and I were talking about this months ago, Anders, before any of this had sprung up, that the public's appetite for any sort of non-direct, I'm talking US-centric right now, non-direct US-related ground invasion is zero right now.
Yeah, despite the remarks by people like Lindsey Graham and John McCain asking for a very muscular response, but that's not going to go anywhere. The public just wouldn't put up with it. I agree with you, Doug. You still hear some of this rhetoric. We've got to get in there and stop these mass murderers, but.
Well, and that sets up, I think, a really interesting. I think I'm using this even in the right context here. It's a sort of moral hazard almost, except in a non-economic sense, where these groups, and much like in our last discussion when we were talking about Russia and Ukraine, they know that they can get away with a lot more now, I believe, and not have to face a direct ground-on-ground troop threat from us or the rest of the world that could quite literally. Actually, I can't say that. We can't quite literally crush them, but we could put up a very, very formidable offense and certainly disrupt their activities if we were to do a full-scale invasion. But
we could crush them if we're willing to stay long enough.
The problem with those full-scale invasions is that we put so much money into them, that you almost incentivize the rebellion itself. So in Afghanistan and Iraq, when so much money was coursing through these countries, right? Taliban and the Iraqi insurgents took a cut of all that, and that fueled their insurgency.
Yeah.
So that's
and
part
now
of the problem.
ISIS is using our equipment as well.
That's right. I mean, Islamic State's the best example, perhaps, of the amount of U.S. Army equipment they grabbed is extraordinary.
Well, it's an I hate to say I told you so type situation, but if you leave in a still very politically unstable environment, I think it was right for a situation like that, and you left with very many unhappy people. I think what I'm trying to get at, though, is especially in sub-Saharan Africa and across the southern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, where you see some of these little pockets uprising. Countries like China and Russia have got to be licking their lips right now because we are still presenting ourselves, and President Obama is still presenting us as the go-to sort of problem solver in this case. We're going to provide air support.
We're the top. Right.
Yeah, we're the cop, but in a much less limited way. We're like a cop with a nightstick instead of the militarized cops.
Yeah, maybe a can of mace. Yeah,
so the issue that we have with that then is if we are a cop with a nightstick, then every time territory is taken, every time there is a massive attack, and we were not able to prevent it or we were not able to do anything about it, these countries, especially like China, who are more directly involved across the entire continent of Africa and actually more directly helping the more developed parts of these countries in an economic way, are starting probably to look like the good guys.
Yeah, and there are a million Chinese at least who moved to Africa in the last 8 or 9 years. I mean,
well, Doug, actually, if you could pull up that chart of yours that shows the relative China-U.S. trade with Africa, that would be great. It's a really great chart.
Give me 1 second, please.
All right. I mean, in Mali, there's a serious situation too. The French did put in ground forces. They had some modicum of success there. They were at least able to close off the Islamists from taking southwestern Mali, and that's a positive thing. But I don't know to what extent that activity fueled, and it's not only that it fuels with the money that a cut of the money that courses through those countries from Western intervention. It's also that fighting the United States or France or one of these big states is really a feather in the cap of some of these extremists who are totally unknown before Western militaries and media come looking at them.
Well, and absolutely, and how awesome is it for them, especially in Iraq and Syria, to be seen using our own equipment against not necessarily ground forces, but to seek their own aims. I think that is the most brilliant marketing ploy that they can do.
Yeah.
I'll pull this chart up too.
They probably see that as sort of humiliating the United States too.
Yeah, can you zoom in on that a little bit, Doug?
Oh, sure. Is that close? I'm sorry.
Go ahead and explain it if you don't mind.
Yeah, 1 second. So what we're looking at while I am zooming in, and apologies for this being a Word thing, because this was there we go, was copied over from our graphics team that built this beautiful chart. What we're looking at is China in the U.S., and we're comparing trade, total exports and imports with each partner. So that would be China and the U.S. with sub-Saharan Africa. Now, I think this is a pretty striking chart, where you see China in 2000 basically totally uninvolved with trade in sub-Saharan Africa. Their trade volume with sub-Saharan Africa has increased 40-fold over the past 15 years, where with the U.S., we're up approximately, it's approximately doubled, from about $30 to $60 billion. You can get the idea of the influence that China's having with this, because I even think I said this last time, Tom Keene, my favorite anchor at Bloomberg, says it's always about the first derivative. You look at the first derivative of this chart, and one is going down and one is actually increasing in its rate upward. And that is because China, as you mentioned, Bob, with 1 million foreign nationals in Africa and also training African employees, has direct foreign investment in every single African country.
Tremendous infrastructure stuff too. Rail lines, highways, buildings. I think the headquarters of the African Union. I mean, but let me ask Doug something. Why did the U.S. Number fall since?
Doug, we still want to see that chart.
Oh, sure. I'll leave it up there.
And it actually fell. It wasn't just below the Chinese investment, but it actually fell. What would explain that? In terms of commodities or?
Right. I think that for us, probably the biggest reason why it fell was twofold. Is one, there was probably a lot of resistance by some of these companies. And a lot of barriers to entry, both from local governments and also from our own government, to take business outside. And at the time, we were only doing direct business in, I believe it was 3 to 5 major African economies. Yeah. So I would not be surprised. I don't have direct data on if there were any substitutions, but some of the large infrastructure projects we might have actually gone in, and I'm thinking of countries like Nigeria and Kenya, and started the basic infrastructure, but the more lucrative projects might have been picked up more quickly and with fewer barriers by Chinese firms down the line.
Well, they may be faster to bribe. The Chinese consider it just sort of a natural process of doing business. The Chinese are much looser about that than we are.
Absolutely, and you would have to. It's not even an assumption. Like, I would be extremely surprised if there's not an inordinate amount of that going on. Because how else would you have projects breezing through so quickly?
Yeah, I mean, they don't have a Corrupt Foreign Practices Act. I mean, they, que sera, sera. The other thing I've got to slide in, I see this going on, I think some of this could be due to the fracking revolution in the U.S. Perhaps we're buying relatively less Nigerian and other African oil.
That's a very, very good point. And
if you look at the chart, it almost exactly follows the fracking revolution.
Absolutely, I think that's a very good point.
So the 2008 drop obviously is from the recession in the U.S.
Yes, but there's a big divergence from 2009.
Saying is from the fracking. You think in 2011 that's when the fracking came in?
I think that's a fair assessment, especially because a lot of the U.S. investment was in the form of private-sponsored capital from companies like GE and large petroleum manufacturers and extraction and exploration, whereas I believe it's China Petroleum, a state-run enterprise, is largely active in Africa. That's what we're seeing, and that's probably why it's so easy to breeze through. I don't have a specific breakdown by industry, but again, it would not be a surprising thing to see a significant oil investment going on in there.
I do know that in the east of Africa, I have people out there who I know who have told me stories about, who are French actually, who had a lot of market share in East Africa a few years back, and the Chinese essentially came in, bribed their way through, and the French companies from these East African areas, including Swaziland in Somalia, get out of the country. We're slowly being eroded out of the country.
Were these mostly natural resources companies we're talking about, like French oil companies, iron ore, that kind of thing?
Those are all, I think, across the board French companies in Swaziland and East Africa generally.
That definitely makes sense. I have one other map one other graphic that our team put together that I can pop up right now. And there's also a great place that you can see this. It's a Bloomberg quick take. I can share the information with you guys later, and everyone who's watching. Something that Bloomberg produces regularly, which are very smart snapshots of all kinds of major political and economic situations that are going across the U.S. I don't know how well this is showing up. I'm going to scale it down a little bit, and then I might zoom into a certain spot. But actually, okay, so I'll pull this up really quickly. What we're seeing right now here, and apologies for the inability for this to scroll. Actually, give me 1 second. I'm going to pull up a map that shows, we call it investing in Africa. It's foreign direct investment, and you can see that there are certain targeted countries here, and I'm going to come back to me, that have received a lion's share of direct investment. Now, this is not split out by the country which is doing it. There we go.
Can you zoom into that map?
Mauritania caught my eye.
I know, right?
Yeah, why Mauritania?
Yes, that's better. Now we can see it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you can see some of the typical, or some of the countries that you would expect to see that have developed relationships with the West and also with Asia, having pretty significant amounts of foreign direct investment. But as you mentioned, Bob, Mauritania having 320 million net inflows. What was it in 2013 compared to Egypt, which had only 71 million? That could have been a direct result of the uprising that went on there. But for Mauritania, it's both their natural resources and also their ability to be a port for all of South and North America. There's also another surprising number that I'm going to scroll down here. Look at Equatorial Guinea, $2.75 billion in net foreign direct investment inflows.
And one of the most corrupt places on the face of the earth, just outstandingly corrupt.
Mm-hmm. And so if
Wow, look at that. God.
Yeah. So you have countries, I think. You have China that's spreading its influence across Africa. They're going to need leaders who are supportive of them, who will also, as they have in the past, the Chinese have stepped in and squashed minor uprisings, both at textile factories they're building and also small, sort of regional religious and secular disturbances that could hurt their business. But ultimately, they need ports to ship out their product. I think a large part of that is an investment in places like Equatorial Guinea, but also I believe that Equatorial Guinea is a big gem and raw material supplier as well.
Yeah,
if you toss the government $3 billion, which is pocket change for a massively growing economy the size of China and the U.S., that is something that could really influence them.
Doug, how much Chinese manufacturing is happening in Africa? Do you have any handle on that? I mean, are the Chinese now sort of, how do I put it, outsourcing the production of cheap socks and underwear and that kind of thing to Africa?
That is exactly what is underway, I think, and especially there was some excellent Bloomberg News reporting on this too, about the manufacturing renaissance that is happening in, well, renaissance is a subjective term, but that's happening in, yeah, exactly, in Nigeria and Ethiopia. It is widely assumed that Africa is or some of these sub-Saharan countries are very comparable to the China that we saw 30 years ago.
Yeah.
In its ability for low cost, low quality human capital, but a massively high unemployment rate across the board, and people who are willing to pay or who are willing to work for very low wages. I'm pulling off of this map really quickly. What is fascinating actually is I ran across, when I was looking over stuff for this the last couple of days, a working paper that was done for a development institute that said that African employment, or I'm sorry, African labor cost in the textile industries, which is where China's spending a lot of its direct investment on the manufacturing side, is actually not as cheap as some of its competitors in Asia, like in Bangladesh and India. So
really, why would that be? I mean, was it sort of $30 a month wage or something like that? But
yeah, I mean,
why would that be cheap? I mean, it's more higher per capita wage than Bangladesh.
Yeah, you're still talking. I'm going to zoom into this, Anders. Don't worry, 1 sec.
Right.
Sorry about this. Actually, no, I'm not. 1 second. You're gonna. As I'm continuing to pull this up, I'll keep trying to talk. You are in Africa. For as miserable as the working conditions might be in a place like Bangladesh, you still have an infrastructure that's already pretty well developed to suit a manufacturing base. I think that's a pretty fair thing to say because we went in there and the Chinese went in there 20 to 15 years ago and ensured that this was something that was built. In Africa, a lot of the trouble that you're running into right now is with pure infrastructure. One of the roads in, I think it's Ethiopia again, from the capital to one major Chinese textile plant, which produces for a lot of American fashion labels. It's about a 30-mile drive, but it actually takes about 4 hours to get from the city center to the factory. Little things like that are a big deal, and then you have local corruption. You have a very unskilled workforce, and that's kind of what's reflected in a chart like this, which is going to take a little bit of walking through. So what you're looking at are labor costs per worker, and these are in U.S. dollars. You're holding everything else constant. All right. You're saying you have a Joe regular employee working in Africa in a textile firm. And then you have comparators, which are other more developed but still largely manufacturing-based economies like Bangladesh and India. And as you can see, the labor cost per worker in Africa across this analysis they did is steadily higher, even inside the confidence bands, than it is for the comparators. And
can you tell us exactly who is in the comparators group?
It is, hold on 1 second, I believe it is Bangladesh, India, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. I can check that out for you once more really quickly. But it is all countries that are very heavily involved in the textile industries.
Right, taking over a lot of it from China. China is now kind of moving beyond that to some extent. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And how many? What's the end? How many data points do you have here?
Total. There were data collected from firms from all the countries from 2006 to 2011, and their N across each country, I mean, statistically significant, was anywhere from 20 to 70 individual firms of varying size, for a total N of, I recall correctly, something around 1,200.
1,200 of the Africa nations and the comparators, something similar.
Exactly.
Sounds like great data.
Yeah, absolutely.
That would surprise many people. It seems counterintuitive, but that's fascinating.
I agree.
Well, there may be more risk in Africa than in the comparators. I think that may be part of the reason why you still got so much work being done in the comparators, which are relatively less risky.
Absolutely.
Also, is some of this because they're closer to the raw materials, or some sort of economic attraction, so they can pay people more? It's more attractive to manufacture because the mineral wealth and the cotton growing and everything are closer by. Is there a role of that, since so much of the African economy is commodities-based?
Yeah, I mean, I think
the relationship of labor and raw materials.
Yeah, in many cases, comparing individual African countries is very much an apples to oranges type comparison, but largely across sub-Saharan Africa, save for the most developed of economies, you're still
South Africa.
Yeah, exactly. You're still an 85%-ish agriculture and commodities-based industry or economy for those who are actually employed.
Yeah.
So I think I mean, as Anders could probably talk to better than I could, I think one of the most significant issues is political risk, because in most of these countries, or in a lot of these countries, we've seen significant shifts in leadership in the past 5 years alone, and this constant threat from Boko Haram and other extremist Islamic groups as well.
Right. I mean, one of the issues that I think is, I read in a very interesting article by Carly Laywell in the U.S. Navy publication, is that there are 1 million Chinese nationals living in Africa right now. 1 million Chinese nationals living in Africa. That's a lot of people. And there's some of the issue, as with this Chinese investment, is the Chinese want to employ and export labor into the African countries, and that creates tensions between the locals who also want those jobs.
It's almost as if they're dealing with their overpopulation problem. I'm sorry to interrupt. It's almost as if the
What'd you say, Robert?
Overpopulation by exporting people to Africa.
Yeah. And I think actually there's one really fantastic picture by a Bloomberg photographer as well that was in a story talking about how at a garment factory, the head of one of China's largest garment manufacturers walked in and harangued a set of employees who didn't have their shirts. Their shirts were tucked in, but they were not tucked in properly, and started screaming at them in Chinese, which they don't understand. Yeah, exactly. I mean, another very probably quite simple explanation too is, even in some of these countries, you do have a national language, but not everyone's speaking it too. So even employees that you would hire for a factory who might have been working on 5 to 10 person farms originally, who are speaking the same language, might not be able to communicate effectively with people they might be working on an assembly line with. So you have some some issues of economy of scale here. If you're trying to grow and expand your enterprise, you might actually run into some significant headwinds as a result. And
maybe these differences between tribal practices too, not just language per se, but at least I'm somewhat familiar with East Africa, having worked there from time to time, and there's so many ethnic differences and daily schedules and practices and expectations. That has to be serious.
Absolutely. And
now, this is an interesting chart that I found, and it's basically Chinese investment in Africa. and this was in that same U.S. Navy publication by Carley.
Hmm.
And I will start zooming in on this. You guys carry on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a very clear sign, Anders, to our earlier point. I think there's only one country in there that still, doesn't even have proper boundaries. I think that China hasn't invested at least $100 million or so in. We're looking at 2000 to 2011, right, Anders?
Yeah, that's
this is 2000 to 2011.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, I actually am quite I'm quite surprised, actually. Well, not surprised, but I find it exceedingly interested that Sudan is one of the top receivers of Chinese financing to Africa in the past 10 years, considering what has happened since 2011. I don't know if they didn't anticipate the political risk or if that was something that might have happened as a result of who was receiving the money.
Before the split off of South Sudan, you mean?
Exactly.
Yeah, right. Well, certainly Sudan has a lot of oil. I think, especially South Sudan. So.
Well, and I think that this lends, what Anders is showing us right now, lends credence to what we were talking about earlier. Almost every single one, except for that provisional loan at the top, was something that was based on oil exploration or a loan. In Ethiopia, you have a loan for a dam construction, hydroelectric. So I think that, like Nigeria, for example, which is a slightly more developed economy, and Ghana as well, a concessionary loan, you are seeing across Africa countries that are at varying stages of the economic development cycle. And I think that the types of projects that are being financed there reflect the type of influence that China wants to have there. If you build and directly finance and actually make happen, which the U.S. has a lot of trouble doing, a hydroelectric dam that brings power to an electorate's people, to 150,000 people, that is one of the clearest signals that you could send, again, hey, we're the good guys. I think that's something that's interesting.
It's like the Suez, that's what started the Suez crisis, the Aswan High Dam. I mean, this hydroelectric stuff and dams are a big deal in Africa.
Absolutely.
I mean,
and they have all kinds of political resonance. Yeah.
One thing that I notice here is that a couple of the countries that were historically communist, like Ethiopia and Angola, are receiving very high rates of investment from the Chinese. South Africa also, the ANC, of course, in South Africa, was an insurgent movement that came to power and probably had possibly had some connections to the Chinese. So I'm seeing that.
It was originally communist dominated, really. The ANC was originally communist dominated.
Now Madagascar also, I think, has some sort of communist connection or socialist connection, and you do see at least a higher level there as well.
Right.
Then I would be interested to compare this, Doug, to your Bloomberg of 2014, and you see a little bit of a correlation. You know, Sudan's high in both, South Africa's high in both.
I can pull that up in a second.
Mauritania's high in both. So we do see Ghana's high in both, right? We do see a kind of a correlation here. Gabon is high in both.
I'm pulling this up right now.
Now, Bob, what was the example of corruption that you had mentioned in Equatorial Guinea?
Well, it's just a very, very corrupt country. That's all. It's famously corrupt. Even by sub-Saharans. I should bring data to try to quantify this. It's just by reputation, exceedingly corrupt. Even more than say Nigeria, for example, which is very, very corrupt.
Do you have any examples, anecdotes for us?
Not really, except that what I've read over the years is all the natural resources are for sale via government ministers, and the people running the government basically consider the natural resources to be their own. But I'm sure, and I love these numbers here too that Doug has pulled out. I'm sure there are better ways of quantifying that than I would be able to do. But I can tell you, by reputation, is outstandingly corrupt. And Gabon is corrupt too, right next to it. But Gabon's not quite as corrupt, in part because some of Gabon's money comes from its national parks, and so they actually get some tourists in there. They have very few tourists in Equatorial Guinea, but Gabon's got these beautiful tropical national parks, so the economy is a little more diversified, and they have a lot of oil too.
Well, Anders, I'm quite interested.
All right, I want to.
Oh, I'm sorry. And
comment
really quickly. Sorry. Go for it, Anders.
This is a comment from Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. It's a quote. It says, "Development is a lot cheaper than sending soldiers." Now, yes, I may agree with that, but I really wonder if development is the right tool at the quantities that we can afford to combat extremism in Africa.
I think that's a.
I mean, is any kind of development aid that we give to Africa a drop in the bucket? Does it go through corruption into the hands of the extremists, and does that in turn actually hurt our cause against extremism?
Well, I know that one of the biggest arguments, Anders, against U.S. food aid to Africa was that it was a sort of unintended consequence of creating a supply gut in food at times during farmers' harvest, which really angered a lot of farmers because it caused local prices for staple grains to plummet in the African countries that were receiving aid, thus compounding the problem. I think that that's one of potentially many examples, but that's the first one that comes to mind for me.
Well, so much of the money is stolen by the government. I mean, just by government officials. Even in kind of the larger, more important countries like Kenya, the thievery is just amazing. But of course, you've got to do development. You've got to sometimes do military aid. Western Europe's a very different place, but in the late 40s, we went and did development, the Marshall Plan, and we created NATO. And you have to do both, adjusting for the regional variations.
I think, and Anders, maybe at some point in the next couple minutes, if you can pull your map back up too. I think that it's a sheer numbers game too, because in 2012 there was $12 billion of development assistance from the U.S. given to African nations. That's $12 billion, all right? And if you look at the direct investment from the private and public enterprises in both my map and then even just the Chinese assistance to Africa, now granted this is over 10 years, I think there's a numbers game at work here where there is so much more, especially in the past 5 years, direct investment flooding into Africa that it's probably paling in comparison, or that the development aid probably pales in comparison to the direct investment. So it goes back to the original question: would you rather receive, food aid or more, hypothetical types of development assistance, or have a dam built if you need electricity? Because 70% of sub-Saharan Africa is still without electric power.
Doesn't that make more sense? Infrastructure. I mean, a lot of that will be stolen too, but something physical that everyone can use, roads, bridges, and so on, doesn't that make the most sense?
Right. Well, going back to Anders,
you can assume that 10% of anything that's put in to a country is going to get taken at every level, right? So in Afghanistan,
more than 10%.
What you see is 10% taken by the Pakistanis as it's shipped in. You see 10% taken by the Taliban when it's coming across the border from Pakistan into Afghanistan. 10% is taken by the government of Afghanistan. Another 10% is taken by whatever the leaders are in the local region where the aid or the development is instituted, whether that's a Taliban leadership or a warlord, an Afghan warlord, or a powerful provincial governor, right? And so that's the problem, is that those percentages get taken out, and by the time you actually get the aid into the hands of the people that need it, or the dam being built, right, half of the money is gone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, ironically, a lot of it ending back in the West, of course. And a great recycling thing, you know, and ends up in New York or the Cayman Islands, the Union Bank in Switzerland.
Anders, the reason why I asked you to pull the map back up, I do not have a sufficient explanation for this. It's just merely a point of curiosity. But I know that your map is only showing Chinese direct investment. Mine is showing global direct investment. But I noticed, because I hadn't seen this earlier, a shift in focus. If you look at Ethiopia in particular, you know, it was one of the top 10 receivers of Chinese direct foreign investment to Africa from 2000 to 2011. But look at it in 2013. It's only $11 million.
Yeah, what happened?
I don't have an answer for that, but it's not just that country. There are others that seem to have fallen out of favor. Granted, again, this is not an apples to apples comparison, but there are, you know, pretty significant differences that I think would warrant, you know, further questions, and anyone watching might have some ideas on.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Look, Kenya, part of which is sort of somewhat developed, very, very low. I mean, I think there are a lot of attractive things about doing business in Kenya. What is that, 13?
Yeah.
I
Extraordinary.
want to change the subject just slightly, and I mean, the Chinese, because they can use bribery, right, and they have, like you pointed out, Bob, when they get back to China, they get on a pat on the back for getting market share.
Yeah, good work, guys. Yeah.
As opposed to our corporations for getting market share if they're to use corruption.
Yeah, it's a criminal
that really
act.
puts U.S. Businesses at a distinct disadvantage in all of these third world countries. And it puts China and Russia, and it used to be France, although I think they're getting a little bit better, it puts China and Russia at a big advantage. Now, of course, China is the only country that has plenty of money to invest, plenty of money to bribe local government officials, but are we going to see, because of this imbalance in purchasing power because of bribery and investment power because of bribery, are we going to see a slow and creeping Chinese takeover of the third world investment space?
I don't think so. I think things will get sort of comparatively worse for the West in the next few years. But in terms of the corruption thing, I think in the long run, having honest, transparent transactions is actually good business. You want to do business with people like that. I think the Africans and some other people in the developing world, Latin America, have made their deals in the long run. I think a major reason why the West is still the richest place in the world and will continue to be so indefinitely, and Japan, is relatively honest, transparent transactions. But I think in the short term, with the Africans are desperate for money, for jobs, and so on, it will help the Chinese, and they will gain influence, continue to gain influence in the next few years. In the long run, I don't think it's good business for them. Well, and why do I think that? I'm just looking at where the strongest economies are. I mean, with all the flaws of Western European economy, the United States, Canada, still, at the end of the day, where do you want to put your money? And even though these crooks in Africa, if they can, they move their money to the West. And that's going to continue.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's definitely good business, to be honest, Bob, but my question is that all of the resources in Africa and all of the market share in Africa, I'm not talking about other places, are going to get taken over by the Chinese, and all the American companies are going to get out, are going to be forced out because of the Chinese ability
I don't think that'll happen.
To bribe.
Yeah, I don't think that'll happen in the long run, because I think that the Africans will find over the long run, some of them told me this is all anecdotal, that it's better in the long run to do business with Western companies. Now, I think the next 2 or 3 years, this natural resources exploitation by the Chinese, I think it may, if anything, accelerate. But looking beyond that, I'm actually somewhat optimistic, assuming we're thinking in terms of rivalry with the Chinese. Because in the long run, the Chinese are not as good to do business with as West. And, of course, again, a lot of the crooks in the developing world, the money ends up in the West. That's because they like the West. They trust it more than they're going to trust the Chinese.
Doug, what do you think?
Yeah.
Doesn't it sort of
I'm kind of contrarian on that, I know, but yeah.
Let's hear what Doug has.
I don't know if that's quite a contrarian view, because I think it might be an optimistic view, but I don't think it's misguidedly optimistic by any stretch of the imagination. And I think it's because I get the distinct impression, this is not a quantifiable thing in my opinion in my case, but doesn't it feel, granted I'm young, I wasn't around for this, but doesn't it feel a lot like what the U.S. was doing in South America and in Southeast Asia 30 or 20 to 40 years ago, where, sure, we were trying to wield political influence. We were probably, and had been documented, bribing and installing a lot of leaders. We had also done that in Africa already, too. And a lot of that ends up backfiring. So I'm a big fan of contrarian views and unintended consequences, and I think an unintended consequence of this might be in the countries where there are more legitimate governments that are more democratically stable, that if they get blindsided by the Chinese, they might turn around, as Bob suggested, and say, hey, we don't like you, we're not going to do business with you. Or, more dangerously, the Chinese are going to try to install a benign dictator that will ultimately turn on them.
Yeah. That has happened elsewhere, and there is a lot of resentment, parts of Africa against the Chinese.
I mean, that's the thing, is that the Chinese are really seeking to support dictators. They're not seeking to support democracy in Africa. They're seeking to support dictators, and it's the dictators who are the most vulnerable to bribes, right? From the Chinese.
That's right. The dictatorships are also the most unstable.
I love your guys' optimism. I wish I were optimistic.
No, it's the medication.
But I don't see the mechanism by which your optimism will actually, the causal mechanism by which your optimism is going to play out. Because unless you have real democracy developing in Africa, I just don't see that causal mechanism.
I think looking at international capital flows and looking at comparative wealth, that's what I'm basing my views on. And also, I think we shouldn't forget there's already a great deal of resentment against the Chinese in some parts of Africa, most of which are, of course, various forms of dictators. So it's an unstable situation for the Chinese.
No, I mean, I think where I would disagree with Bob is most, I think, more concerning for the Chinese than a democratic rebellion would be a dictator turning his or his back on the country, either nationalizing an entire industry or outright violence against Chinese contractors. I mean, I don't personally see that happening in the next few years, as I'm on Anders' side with this, and by few years I mean decades, especially as our sphere of influence continues to shrink. I think that the Chinese are going to become more aggressive and ultimately more successful in acquiring business enterprises and ultimately land and ultimately strategic value in Africa.
Well, I agree with you about as I said, say the next 3 or 4 or 5 years in the long run, which means it's arbitrary 5, 10 years out. I don't think it's going to go quite as well for the Chinese.
Well, look at North Korea. I mean, China may be trying to turn Africa into a big African North Korea.
Help us.
Right? It's a very stable regime. Very stable.
No, I think it's very unstable. It all depends upon one royal family. Somebody dies. I mean, look at the stuff in Russia when Putin disappeared for a week. I mean, it's unstable. And when they go fast. So,
Oh, that's
the Tsar's family.
North Korea. Russia is a transitioning regime going from democracy to dictatorship, and North Korea is a solid dictatorship, right? So yes, a lot of transition too in Africa, but the direction that the Chinese are pushing it, I think, is towards a more autocratic political system.
I agree with you. I actually agree with you on that, but it's very unstable for the Chinese, and they are getting into bed. They're getting a sleeping bag with people who are not particularly popular.
Yeah. All right. Do you guys have any final comments? Any final comments at all for this evening? We're about to wrap up.
Oh boy. If I can say, I think we should pay more attention to Africa. Simple as that. Not just sort of Africa Command, military stuff. I think Obama was right. There was some hectoring last year when he had that summit at the White House for African leaders. I think we should I think we need to do a lot of symbolic stuff, more symbolic stuff like that. And I think the aid we give to Africa, we're going to have to learn how to funnel more of it through respectable NGOs. I'm not very optimistic about governments getting in general more honest there, but I think there are ways of boosting development there in a very visible way through more targeted use of NGOs.
I think when you're confronted against a massive Chinese machine, however, I think NGOs in most cases are going to get crushed, and I think that goes to Anders' point. I think that at least in my experience and from what I know, the Chinese are using bribes, are using subjugation. They're doing what the Europeans, the U.S. and the Soviets did with in imperialism in Africa, and I think that ultimately Africa, we don't realize it now, is going to become a very potential hotspot, I think, for political interest, and in countries that aren't necessarily the native countries there. It could become a sort of Cuba, if you'd like, for countries that want to expand their spheres of influence, because as soon as China strikes a military deal with an African country that's close to Europe or close to the east coast of the Atlantic, I think that kind of changes the entire playing field.
You mean like with the some sort of Chinese alliance with the Nigerians or something like that?
Yeah, I don't know if
there's so many countries in Africa, it'd have to be something pretty big. And
yeah, you can correct me here with my terminology, Anders, but I mean, wouldn't it seem reasonable, especially with what we're seeing with China in the South China Sea, their expansion of oil wells and also of the airfields that are going up on the artificial islands, to see something similar go up in Africa in the next few years?
Yeah, sure, you could see it. I mean, it's China seems to be territorially aggressive and expansionist.
They're imperialist.
Very close to its home. But Doug, I have one final question to ask you, and that is, what would be your policy prescription or advice to the President Obama as far as what should U.S. policy be towards Africa?
Making very clear this is my opinion and not the opinion of our organization, who does a lot of charitable and philanthropic work out in Africa. My personal opinion, if you have to take in this sort of case all the variables into account, but given the assumption that countries like China and Russia are making their presence known in Africa and are doing a better job of investing in Africa and building relationships, either right or wrong, with African leaders, what we can do is not open up and sponsor sort of willy-nilly, fancily named trade deals. I forgot exactly what our name was for the $14 billion or something that was pledged over 10 years that probably won't come, but actually open the door, remove some of the barriers to entry for Africa and to some of the countries that actually would like to do business with us, because there are countries there, and allow our very vibrant, our very excited, and our very adept private enterprise to go in and make a difference. Because look, I mean, these are some of the fastest growing economies in the world, and if we're not a part of it, then we're going to run into trouble.
New England Diary, and from Bloomberg, who's a Bloomberg reporter. Thank you so much for joining us, and we are cutting out now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.